It's the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring uprisings, and as many of you who follow CSI's work will know that we issued a genocide warning in the autumn of 2011. We could see the trends taking place, that the uprisings had gone in a very sectarian direction, were becoming increasingly tolerant, and that conditions existed throughout the Middle East, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, etc., for genocide. Now we are 5 years after that genocide warning, and we find that the United States government just some few weeks ago has issued a genocide determination, actually confirming that the horrors, the massive ethnic or religious cleansing that has taken place does amount to genocide. Now, for anyone who wants to know about this process of massive religious cleansing, starting from the earliest days of the Arab Spring uprising up to the American genocide determination, must read Forsaken, the Persecution of Christians Today in the Middle East. It's a must-read for those that have that interest. It's easy to read, and I heartily recommend it. Now, we're privileged to have the author of this wonderful book, Daniel Williams, here with us this evening. Daniel has spent many, many years in the Middle East, on the ground, speaking to everybody from the grassroots level to senior members of government of the region. He knows the region intimately, and we're very pleased to have Daniel with us, and let us give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for welcoming me and being here on this beautiful spring day. I'm sorry that I don't speak the language that is spoken in this part of Switzerland. If we were in Lugano, I would do better because my wife is Italian, but here I'm pretty hopeless, so thank you again for inviting me. It's interesting that John mentioned that they issued a genocide warning back in 2011. I say this because in my country, the United States, I'm American, recently the State Department declared that Christians in Iraq face genocide. So this was sort of a step forward, except in one important detail. They said almost at the same breath that they would do nothing about this. This is a symptom of why I call my book Forsaken. Christians, and not just Christians in the Middle East, but we're going to talk about Christians today, have been abandoned to their fate. In Iraq, they have no advocates, period. They have no influence or power in Iraq, where they are being persecuted, and in northwestern Iraq, driven from their homes. In Syria, perhaps they have an advocate, but it's an advocate that is embroiled in a very vicious civil war. Is the government thinking about Christians? Perhaps, but the war is so vicious that it's hard to think that the Christians have much of it would be difficult to think of their future in Syria, no matter the outcome of the war. But it's not just those two countries at war where Christians have problems. That's why I say persecution in the Middle East. In Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak, the overthrown president, under the first transitional government, under the second Muslim Brotherhood government, under the current government, they're forced to seek refuge with these governments, none of which are democratic or believe in equal rights for Christians. And so in Egypt, Christians are subject to mob rule, to corrupt police, to problems which you don't make the news very much. Sometimes they make the news. Just before 2011, there was a major terrorist attack in Alexandria, directed at 2 churches that were blown up. But most of the persecution in a place like Egypt goes unremarked. Palestine also, the ever-shrinking population of Christians, which has shrunk because of the conflict, which is now in whatever years, 60, 70 years in Israel-Palestine, continues. Economic problems, isolation, but now made more intense by fears among the Christians that what I call radical jihad, radical holy war by certain Muslim groups has infiltrated the national movement in Palestine, of which the Christians felt they were a part. So we have from Iraq to Egypt a problem of Christian persecution. I picked this area not because Christians aren't persecuted in other countries. Let's take Nigeria, which I've also visited, but a very intense persecution of Christians by the group called Boko Haram. But because this region, this geographic area from Iraq to Egypt is where Christianity was born. We tend to think of the Holy Land as Palestine, Israel, that area. But the Christian Holy Land is actually wider. I'm sure many of you know that the word Christian was not initially said in Jerusalem. It was said in Antioch, which is now part of Turkey. St. Paul was up there. St. Thomas went to Mesopotamia, now Iraq. St. Mark went to Egypt. And they created what they used to call apostolic churches, churches founded by the apostles. So the first apostolic sees, I don't want to give too much religiously, but this is the homeland of Christianity. And the first apostolic sees were Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. I've covered the Middle East as a reporter for American newspapers and then as a researcher for Human Rights Watch for many years. Human Rights Watch is an independent human rights organization. And I came across Christian persecution over the years, over the more or less 2 decades I was over there. I didn't put it together as a pan-Middle East issue until, in fact, I was in Egypt during Arab Spring, when it became clear there was an ideology at work, that there's an idea behind Christian persecution. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, that there's an idea that is relevant to the problems Christians have, not only in Syria, not only in Iraq, but also Lebanon, Palestine, and somewhat in Israel, and Egypt. But part also of a larger ideology that involves us, Westerners, and involves Muslims themselves. This ideology has a root in let me first say, though, I don't want to ignore the context of all this. Other things have happened. The West itself has some responsibility for the intensified and accelerated persecution of Christians, largely because of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. There have been other issues of Western intervention or tolerance of violence and certain governments in the Middle East that contribute to this. I don't want to ignore the corruption of the various Middle East dictatorships that pretend to protect Christians but do not protect Christians and have never protected Christians. I don't want to ignore the poverty that creates vast frustrations among the masses of Arab and Muslim and Christian people in the Middle East. That's all relevant and all important to the development of this ideology, which I will date its growth from 1967, the war between Israel and Arab countries, and the reaction of Muslims, in particular, to this war, and also the discrediting of some ideas that protected Christians at the time. But I don't want to ignore it, but I'm going to only talk about the ideology behind persecution of Christians. This ideology is based in two branches of Islam. And let me say, the critics of Islam, especially in the United States and perhaps here in Europe, attribute the persecution of Christians and other minorities in the Middle East to Islam as a whole. And the defenders of Islam, certainly in the United States and perhaps also here in Europe, say, no, this has nothing to do with Islam. This is alien to our beliefs and our traditions. They are both wrong, of course. The critics are wrong to paint such a broad stroke. There's no question that Christians under traditional Islam are subjugated, but they have not always been persecuted. And sometimes they play a very important role in this Islamic world, especially in the Middle East. The defenders are being evasive at best to suggest this has nothing to do with Islam. The two ideologies, or the two branches of Islam, from which this focus on Christians come, are known as Salafism and Wahhabism. They're related, although separate by centuries. Salafism is a long-time branch of Sunni Islam that says Muslims must live as the Prophet Muhammad lived and his companions lived. And they follow strictly the texts of the Quran. In fact, everything that comes after they call things innovations and stuff is irrelevant. The whole history of Islam and Islamic civilization, it doesn't count for them. Wahhabism is related to this, but it's a much later 18th century version based in Saudi Arabia. So how does this Wahhabism spread? How did it become a factor? In the 19th century, the Saud family, you probably have heard about the Saud family, maybe they have money here in Zurich, I don't know, made an alliance with a man named Al-Wahhab. In return for his ideological support for their tribe, which was out to conquer all of the Arabian Peninsula, they said that they would spread Wahhabism, this Wahhabi notion of conservative Islam. That even might not be relevant except for the fact that oil, the Saud family and the Saudi Arabia became very wealthy, and they used some of the wealth to spread this ideology. And you don't want to discount Saudi Arabia in any way from the spread and even the persecution of Christians, because it is based on these two branches of Islam. Where does jihad fit in? Jihad means holy war, or it means struggle, but it refers either to the defense of Islam or, in the earliest days especially, the expansion of Islam. And there's hundreds of scholarly and legal restrictions and guidelines for jihad within Islam. Through most of the centuries, holy war did not refer to have anything to do with indigenous Christians, partly because in the early days, when Islam conquered what is now Greater Syria, that is Syria from the Turkish border to Egypt, and even after, Christians were in the majority, and the Muslims were ruling an empire, not trying to destroy it. So they didn't say kill Christians. Indeed, they absorbed much from the Christian natives of the time. That would change a little bit in the 13th century, and excuse me for this long historical business. Even during the Crusades, the Christians were not persecuted, partly because the Church of Rome that launched the Crusades was in fact having religious disputes with Christians in the Middle East, especially the Coptic Church in Egypt. In the 13th century, things changed a little bit because some Christian groups joined with the Crusades and with invading Mongols against the Islamic rulers of the time. Still, they were, and it was a time of persecution. In fact, it's the period when Christians became a minority because, in fact, they were more taxes, more restrictions on worship were put in this period. I will fast forward, though, now to the 50s. So we don't want to go through the entire history of Islam. Otherwise, we will have a 2-day talk, and that's not 1-day talk. Because of these disasters in the Arab world, there are various prescriptions, how to fix this among Muslims, but also Christians. Let me just add that Christians, as part of the fabric of the Middle East, were not unaware of the weakness of the Arab world. They didn't view it as the Islamic world, they viewed it as the Arab world. Christians were anti-colonial. Christians in Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries were against British colonialism and were major figures in the Nationalist Party of Egypt. Palestinian Christians were against the Zionist project in Israel-Palestine. There's no secret about this. George Habash, who more or less invented airline hijacking, was a Christian, but he wasn't acting as a Christian, nor was the inventor of Baathism, who was also a Christian, Michel Aflaq, acting in the name of Christianity. He was acting in the name of a citizen of this wider Arab world that was fighting against what they viewed as colonialism. And what was colonialism? This held for a long time, in fact. Like I say, the Christians in the Middle East before, in the late 19th century and half of the 20th century were very much part of the fabric and the political, social, and moral fabric of the Middle East. Why did this change? The disasters of 1948, but especially 1967, gave rise to different prescriptions, and one of them was Wahhabi and Salafism that said the problem is that Islam has been weakened. And one of the ways it's been weakened is the presence of Christianity in the midst of Muslims in the Middle East. And there's an evolution even of this thinking. In the 1950s, there was a man named Saad Qutb. He's very well known in the Middle East. He visited the United States and spent time in Colorado, of all places. And from his experience in Colorado, which is far from the most liberal, sort of Babylonian Sodom and Gomorrah part of the United States, wrote a book about how awful the West was. But he also wrote about Christianity. Most of what he wrote, he's Egyptian, most of what he wrote was traditional. They should be subjugated. They should pay poll tax. But he also revised an idea that Christians cannot publicly expose their religion in front of Muslims. So no bells, no crosses, no expressions of Christianity that would somehow jeopardize Muslim faith. So this is rather different from saying we don't want to westernize, because let's be very clear, Christians in the Middle East are not Westerners. Their churches predate Europe. They predate the idea of a West. But here you begin to see that the problem of Christianity and Christians in the Middle East is because they are there. And this is a break from traditional Muslim tolerance, pay taxes and so on, but you're people of the book. This is the famous line. I think you all know it. Jews and Christians are people of the book. They can stay with restrictions. Al-Qaeda expands it. They make it worse for Christians. There's a writer named Ali al-Aliyani who also accepts traditional tolerance, but he says it must be clothed in humiliation and submissiveness. So this is basically, Christians are gonna walk around like bent over. He said that the subjugation of the people of the book to the laws of Islam, they must be forbidden from openly proclaiming the religion, and they must be forbidden from involving themselves on such Christian practices as interest, fornication, in his view, and other things. So again, it's the present. He doesn't even relate it to Westerners. Their being among Muslims is a bad thing. And what's his solution? He ends this one thing that I'm reading from, "Oh Allah, destroy the Jews." The Jews are still feature, even though there's no Jews around, they still feature among these people. "Destroy the Jews, the Christians, and polytheists, and whoever has befriended them or helped them in any way against your servants," meaning Muslims and believers. Now, if you're some guy who has decided to join ISIS, you read this and you have religious sanction to kill Christians. That's what it amounts to. It ignores traditional Islam. It ignores any development of human rights or rules of war within Islam. It ignores all that. They go further, Al-Qaeda goes further, by conflating Muslims with their domestic enemies, not Westerners. They're yet not saying that Assyrians or Chaldeans are Westerners, but they conflate them with their enemies. In the case of Iraq, it's Shiites. Now, let me just preface what I'm about to say is that Iraqi Christians have no influence over the government in Baghdad. Not since the American invasion have they had influence with the government in Baghdad or with the American government or with nobody. They're just there, observing their own demise. So Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, you may know the name, was the founder of the Islamic State of Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq is the forerunner of the Islamic State of Iraq and Shams, which is another word for Greater Syria. Okay. In 2004, what does he say? He says, when Muslims defeat the Christians, this causes distress among the Shiites. The Shiites, of course, are the dominant group in government and the majority in Iraq. And if the polytheists and Christians defeat the Muslims, this occasions a holiday among the Shiites. Huh? What Christians could beat anybody in Iraq? They're a minority cowering pretty much in their church, and they're not allied with the Shiites. This is nonsense, but he says it. Because he says the Shiites are not Muslim, and what's the goal of the Shiites? They follow the path of Jews and Christians in lying and infidelity. So you have the cards, or the odds, the cards against Christians are being stacked. There's no way. They're bad for Muslims by being there. They're bad for Muslims, the true Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, because they are allied with the Shiites, which is not so. And then they're going to take it further. There's a man named Mustafa Abdul Qadir Set Mariam, who you may or may not have heard of. His nom de guerre, his war name is Abu Musab al-Suri, and al-Suri means Assyrian. He broke with Al-Qaeda, the way that the Islamic State was broke with Al-Qaeda. And he has a lot of importance regarding what goes on in Europe, but also what goes on in the Middle East. Because he, among his many innovations, said, to carry out holy war, you don't need orders from some guy in Pakistan. You don't need orders from anybody. Wherever a Muslim is, he can perform holy war, and he doesn't need. And this is a break also from certain, I don't want to get too deep, but certain Islamic tradition which actually put restrictions on who can order jihad. There were actually rules dating way back to who can order this. He says, no one has to order it. And combined with the fact that the Islamic State says that Christians should be the target of holy war, it means that any Muslim can do what he wants to a Christian if he feels that this is his duty. What does he say specifically about Christians? He also brings in Jews, but again, what Jews in Syria, right? He declares a fatwa, he declares a statement against the government in Damascus. The government in Damascus, its security forces are dominated by Alawites, which is an offshoot of Islam that mixes several religions together. Nonetheless, they're not Sunni, and they're enemies of the Islamic State, but also some of these more conservative Sunnis. What does he say? Again, the Alawites and the Christians are in league to do what? To stop Muslims from hating Christians and Jews, to make all relations with Christians and Jews normal, and that with this alliance, the Alawites will force Muslims to wear the clothing of Jews and Christians, and emulate their fads, their hairdos, their gestures, their diet and drink, and their way of life, and turn Muslims into Jews, Christians, heretics, and aimless cattle. So we're definitely back to, not only does he conflate Christians with the Alawites, there's no question that Christians in a difficult position in Syria, in fact, have come to support the government of Assad, but not in order to make Muslims start drinking beer. This is absurd. So they're both the enemies politically, and their presence is bad because it takes Muslims away from the true faith. So there's no out for the Christians. They're either allied with the enemies of Sunni Islam, or their just being is a bad thing for Muslims. You hear a bell and Muslims are going to immediately stop praying 5 times a day. And you see this distortion in many instances. One of the most awful ones, of course, is the beheading in 2015 of the Christians in Libya by a branch of the Islamic State. They don't just behead them, and they don't even just say it's because they're Christians. They say that these Egyptians, and one gentleman from Chad, belong to the Crusader Coptic Church of Egypt. But as everyone I'm sure here knows, the Copts had nothing to do with the Crusades. And on the contrary, in the First Crusade and several Crusades, because the Crusades was launched by the church in Rome that was having a dispute with the Egyptian church, the Crusaders themselves mistrusted the Copts, and when they, for their brief period, or their period that they controlled Jerusalem, would not let Egyptians make pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which was the whole point of the early Crusades. So it's also this you of course have where the Christians are linked with the West. Indigenous Christians in the Middle East are, of course, they're linked with the West by diaspora and their relatives and so on, but they're not Western in the sense that we think. They're indigenous. They're from there, and as I said, they were part of the fabric, part of the anti-colonial struggle, part of the so-called Arab Renaissance of the late 19th century. They are part of education. They're part of politics in the Middle East until the end of the 20th century. And then we'll see, because of this focus on jihad, that they're really sidelined now. They have no real role politically or socially in the Middle East. This is the idea. Christians have no place in the Middle East. That's the summary of what I'm saying, according to radical jihadists of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the previous Islamic State in Iraq, a group called Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, the many other jihad groups in now operating in Syria. But as you'll see when I go down this list of countries, not just the 2 countries at war. Of course, its impact is obvious in Iraq. The expulsion of Christians from Mosul and Nineveh province in July 2014. And in Syria, it's not enough for Islamic State or Nusra or one of the other groups to take a Christian village for some military reason. They also feel it necessary to burn churches or deface icons or destroy Christian property. But it's not just the countries at war, and this is part of the thing I try to point out in this book. In Egypt, a country that's not been at war for many years, during the reign of Hosni Mubarak, who was overthrown in 2011, during the reign of this interim government after Mubarak fell, during the reign of Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood elected president of Egypt, and now during the reign of Mohammed al-Sisi, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, Christians are being persecuted. It's not a government policy, but what I found in my long experience, I was like 10 years in Egypt from the 2011 on, the state doesn't protect Christians. Police don't protect them. They have no protection under the law. You can kill a Christian with impunity. You can take his property. You can burn down his house. You can burn churches. All these incidents that I write about in the book regarding Egypt went unpunished, including the New Year's Eve 2010-2011 bombing of churches in Alexandria. What was the government response? Mubarak in power at that time. What was his response? Oh, some crazy people did this. And this is always the response. Anyone who attacks Christians is a nut and has nothing to do with Islamic radicalism. The Christians do not have protection under the Egyptian government. The government is reluctant to prosecute Muslims for a crime against Christians. The police tend to sympathize with Muslims no matter what the crime. it's persecution by omission. They do not really protect the Christians because Egypt is not a country of the rule of law, which is what during Arab Spring, the young Coptic Christians who were involved in Tahrir Square, that's what they wanted, the rule of law and equality of citizenship. That doesn't exist in Egypt. We'll see what happens in Syria. It's certainly not existing in what's left of Iraq. Lebanon has a different issue. Palestine, which I'll get to now. What's the problem with the Palestinians? I think everyone here knows that the Palestinian population has been decreasing over decades. Economic issues, the endless conflict, the isolation of where they live, their need for their children to be educated somewhere else as a way of moving forward. These chronic issues for the Palestinian have now been aggravated by fears that the Islamic State and Salafis and Wahhabis have infiltrated the Palestinian movement. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and certainly in Gaza has been guilty of persecuting the very small Christian community in the Gaza Strip. Girls and boys shouldn't attend class together. Girls shouldn't ride on the back of motorcycles. And this also applied to Muslims, but it's especially directed to Christians who don't believe in the segregation, even in the most conservative churches of Palestine. But in the Gaza Strip, beyond Hamas, there's also the Salafis who don't think Hamas is Islamic enough. And they also want to restrict Christians. But there's so few Christians now, it's possible there's a hiatus. There's only 1,500 left in the Gaza Strip. At the beginning of, I think around 2008, there were 3,000, very little. So let's move to the West Bank where there is more, but dwindling. Yasser Arafat, for his many faults, was pretty clear that the Palestinian national movement was secular. I was once at a press conference with Yasser Arafat in Gaza, and someone was comparing, because it was beginning to bubble, the Islamic influence in the PLO, the Palestine Liberation, was beginning to bubble, and Yasser Arafat said, we're not Lebanon. He got very angry at this notion that his state, or his future state, was not secular. That began to change in the year 2000, the so-called Second Intifada. Hamas, which is the Islamic resistant movement, the one that rules Gaza, had outflanked the PLO in terms of violence, but also in terms of focusing the goals of the Palestinian campaign for statehood. Hamas wants an Islamic state. And what does this mean to Christians? It means subjugation, jizya, poll tax, taxes, and so on and so forth. The PLO, because by 2000, excuse me for these details, the PLO was less popular than ever, probably. And so Yasser Arafat himself begins to embrace Islam as a focal point of the Palestinian movement. They name this intifada the Al-Aqsa Intifada, after the mosque in the Haram Sharif. And he creates a group called the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which was the suicide band of the PLO, not Hamas. Now, Christians, this was like a red light for them. Suddenly, what was a secular movement in which all the Palestinians who had been dispossessed in 1948 and 67, suddenly the Christians were sort of shoved aside. And they actually recognized this. There were protests in letters to the Palestine Liberation saying, listen, what's this Al-Aqsa stuff? We're in Bethlehem, we're in El Bira, we're in Ramallah, we're Christians, and we're not, They said this came from the highest, this is from the top, and this is the way it is. And so after that, the Palestinian movement became nationalist and Islamic. Christians were also off. They didn't agree with the attacks on civilians. They weren't on that thing. So they really were marginalized for the first time from really formally from the Palestinian national movement. Today, again, they sense the radicalization of some Palestinians. You can say it's understandable. Nothing's happened in the peace process. What peace process? Nonetheless, when, as I saw last year, Salafi outfits, the tunic, you may be familiar with it, a white tunic with pantaloons that are slightly above the ankle, a certain kind of beard, the women with niqabs. I had never seen this before in Bethlehem in all my years of working there. And Christians, it's not like they didn't notice. Of course they noticed this. This has just made them fearful. I don't want to say it's primarily the source of current migration from Palestine, but it's another element. If you're sitting around the kitchen table having hummus and coffee in Palestine and you think, well, you know, economy's not so good, we can't go to Jerusalem, we can't do this, and plus away, that hill over there is full of Salafis, maybe George or Michel should emigrate. That's the conversation. You don't hear this from the PLO. You don't hear it in usual public statements to the press, but if you spend enough time with Palestinians, that's what they'll tell you. So what is to be done? I've laid out obvious problems in Iraq, in Palestine, in Egypt. And I leave Lebanon out, but they're very nervous about the war issue and how it might affect their enclave, what is effectively an enclave. What's to be done? Can anything be done? I'll take the most urgent thing. In the book and in public articles I've written, and I'm not the only one who's done this, I ask that the United States in particular, but this would apply to Europe, accept refugees from Iraq for political asylum. Now, why do I do this? I don't do this, as some Christian groups and others do, because they're Christian. No, that's not the issue. Under international law, copied exactly by American law, and as I understand it, Swiss law, if you have what is called a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, because of political, but also because of religious belief, you should be granted, you should be able to apply at least for political asylum. It's written down. President Obama, my president, has rejected this thing. The Europeans, I don't see anyone making this argument. It is as clear as black and white. And why do I say the Christians in Iraq are, let's say, different from the Shia or the Sunnis? The Christians in Iraq were not fleeing warfare when they left Mosul. The fighting had stopped. The sequence was the Islamic State entered, Christians left, they went back and said, okay, things are okay. It's not wonderful but they felt things were bad before when the government was in control. We'll stay. I have a store, I have a furniture store, I have a clothing store, I have a grocery store, I have a house. Let's go back. And they went back from Christian villages in Nineveh province back to Mosul. And then the Islamic State said, to stay, you have to convert to Islam, basically. And so they left. There wasn't fighting going on. As you see, it's almost 2 years, and Mosul is still under the control of the Islamic State. They couldn't stay and remain Christians. They could stay if they changed their entire identity, their entire religious piece. And even then you wonder, and I don't want to get into the history of conversions, either in Spain to Catholicism or in Muslim countries to Christians to Islam, and how the mistrust, they couldn't stay, and they left. This, to me, is a clear case of having a fear of persecution if you return home. Can you return home if you're a refugee in Kurdistan to Mosul? Will you be crazy, in my view? And in their view, let me add. That should be done. It hasn't been done. It hasn't been promoted. When I think Slovakia accepted Christians, they did it on the basis of Christianity, not on international law. I don't know that Switzerland, this is even an issue here. In the United States, it came up, and Obama gave a an explanation for not making a case of the Christians, and it was sophistry. It was a false argument saying that we, Americans, do not have a religious test for our compassion. Now, Obama's a lawyer, so he understands exactly what he's doing. Of course, we don't have a religious test for our compassion, but we do have a religious test for refugee policy. He didn't say we don't have a religious test for refugee policy. He says for our compassion. And this somehow struck a chord with Americans. Because the phrase, I'm sorry for this detail, the phrase religious test has nothing to do with refugee policy. It's two words from the American Constitution that forbids religion as being a prohibition on holding government office. That's what it refers to. It doesn't refer to anything else but that. And he used it, and a lot of Americans who don't read our own Constitution think, oh yes, we don't have a religious test, we can't discriminate. We do. We took Bosnians, Germans took Bosnians, we took people from Kosovo, we took Jews from the Americans took Jews from the Soviet Union, Americans took Iranians. We take plenty based on religion. It's not so. So Obama's been dishonest. The Europeans kind of, given the atmosphere about immigration on this continent, have not really taken up the issue in every serious way. But that's what should be done for the Iraqis. You're probably thinking now, what about the Syrians? Here I take a less purist view. There's 2 million Syrian Christians. They're spread all over the place, in the country, outside the country, in Lebanon, some in Turkey, perhaps some in Jordan. No one's going to take 2 million. Even splitting them up, no one's going to take 2 million. The best that could be done, for many reasons, but certainly for this reason, is that the Syrian refugees of all kinds, Shia, well not Shia so much as Alawites, Sunni Muslims, Christians, Baha'i, whoever else is left out there, they should have proper refuge in the countries surrounding it. And for Christians, this also means not putting them in the camps, but registering them as refugees, with the UN, the United Nations Refugee Agency, so they could get help, but they fear living among the Muslims in the camps, with reason. There have been incidents in these camps of Christian girls being abused by young Muslim men. That should be done. Europe and the United States have not made, as you see with this thing of paying Turkey off now to stop them from coming, that there has not been proper, in 5 years, neither Europe nor the United States nor anyone else, or nor anyone in the Middle East has made proper preparation and consistent help for refugees of all sorts from the Syrian war. How is it possible after 5 years that Angela Merkel had to have the European Union provide $3 billion just to stop them from coming? Where was the $3 billion for the camps themselves? This is going to Turkey. So let me not get too off on Turkey. I saw an Austrian politician the other day speaking in the Austrian parliament against the Turkish ambassador. It was sort of frightening, so I won't go on with this. Some of you may ask, and I certainly asked when I was in Kurdistan talking to the Iraqis, what about this question of bearing witness, continuing to live in the Christian Holy Land, which stretches from Iraq to Egypt? I'm sure some of you have heard that the hierarchy, bishops and patriarchs of different churches say they should stay. They should bear witness. This is the original home of Christianity. How can we empty it of Christians, even from Iraq? I asked this question, and actually it was pretty unanimous down in Kurdistan. And I'll just read you a statement from a priest. He's a Chaldean priest. Chaldean church is in communion with Rome. It's a split off from an Assyrian church way back. It's a bit complicated in the history of this, but he's a priest. He's a remarkable man. He was tortured 9 days in Baghdad several years ago, not during this recent thing. I'll give you a little detail of his torture to horrify you, but to show you how remarkable he is to even go back to Iraq. He was kidnapped, as many priests in Iraq were. Some were killed, some were not. They held him for ransom. And it was kind of a give and take. And in the middle, it didn't look like they were going to get ransom. So they took a hammer and broke his nose, broke his teeth, and broke his back. And they forbid him to drink water for 4 days. Normally that kills you. You can do without food for 4 days, but you can't do without water. And he survived. Eventually, his parish in Baghdad paid the money. They got $85,000 together and paid. Without telling him, they said, come with us, put him in a car, and he thought, well, this is it, they're gonna kill me. Went for a ride around Baghdad. They pushed him out of the car, and he said, this is what he told me, he said, I waited for the shot, and there was no shot. He wandered around till he was found by a fellow priest, and he survived, and he had surgery in Italy, had surgery in Germany, and I think some surgery in Iraq. And he looks great. He's a tough guy. Here's what he told me about whether Christian. And then he went back to Mosul, which is his hometown, to preach there. And then when everyone left, he takes care of Christian refugees at a church in Erbil, Kurdistan. I asked him, should Christians stay? Can they go home? What about bearing witness to the places where the apostles of Jesus walked? He says, stay to prove what? What is it to remain if you cannot worship? If you are forced to pay special taxes? If you can't live in dignity? Our bishops are fooling us. He didn't say the Pope in Rome, but he said, our bishops are fooling us. And themselves by urging people to stay. If we have to live the same life in Mosul and the villages around as before, we will remain enslaved. Iraq is not for Christians anymore. And he's right, Iraq is not for Christians. I understand the religious reason for bearing witness, but how much suffering can the Iraqi Christians take? Because it wasn't just Mosul. As I point out in the book, they'd already gone through 11 years of persecution in Baghdad and Mosul and other places, and plenty. I talk about Father Douglas's torture. A bishop in Mosul was killed. His body taken to a dump, all dismembered with his head on. I mean, horrible stuff. You can read it. It's not the kind of bedtime reading you want to read your children, because it's quite striking what they had been through, and common citizens also. And it's not like the Americans weren't warned, or at least advised. You know, you may remember that the Pope John Paul II, sent an envoy to Washington, Cardinal Pio Laghi, to explain what would happen to minorities, Iraq in general, but to minorities if they did this, if they overthrew Saddam Hussein. It's not that they like Saddam Hussein, but they understood the dynamic of Iraq. The Americans said a couple things. Bush didn't read the letter from the Pope. He said, his people said as they were ushering Pio Laghi out, well, don't worry, it's going to be over like that, which they were telling the American people also. And listen, we're with you on the issue of abortion. So you're like, what more do you want from us? We've got to do this. And what happened and during the occupation, they never answered the needs of any of the minorities, not just the Christians, the Yazidis, the Sabaeans, these other groups, ancient groups in Iraq. They refused to acknowledge there was a sectarian problem in Iraq. I mean, you can be a 5-year-old child and see that from the beginning. It doesn't take much. And that these Christians would be victims along with others. And that Shia neighborhoods in Baghdad were emptied by Sunnis, and Sunni neighborhoods were emptied by Shia, and they don't live together anymore, and the Christians have to leave. That's the sort of basic issue in Iraq. I don't think it's right for the churches to say they should stay. That's my position, and I think that's the position of the refugees. Maybe they'll stay, but they should be offered something else. Unfortunately, in Europe and the United States, it's caught up in this immigration crisis that everyone talks about. So no one's going to I don't know of anyone, I don't know, if anyone in this country is bringing it up, let me know, but certainly not in the United States. Donald Trump mentioned Christians the other day, but in this vague way that Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, mentioned stuff, but not with any reason why it should happen. And Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, said, no, we don't have a religious test for this. So I don't have much hope there. Let me go on. Long-range things. Can the Middle East be fixed is what I'm going to ask. I'll answer it at the end. Certainly on the West, these promiscuous invasions without thinking of the consequences have to end. These invasions have done no good for the Middle East generally, and not for Christians and other minorities in particular. They've been destructive. They suffered, Christians in Iraq suffered from the first year on of the American occupation. It wasn't something that happened, like I say, 2 years ago. And I told you that they were warned. Will the Russian bombing on behalf of Bashar al-Assad in Syria help? It certainly has helped the regime. How this will play out later in this new Syria, I think it's impossible to predict. Will there be one Syria, more Syrias? Where will the Christians fit in if some form of the current government stay in? If they're overthrown, what will happen? For me, it's unpredictable. John can give you a longer lecture on this issue. I don't have many ideas about what could happen. The West should be consistent in backing equality in the Middle East. Again, I speak a lot about the Americans because they're all mealy-mouthed. They don't actually believe what they say. This is especially true in Egypt. They're constantly lecturing, and then they go send their people to congressional hearings in Washington to say, we can't do anything about human rights in Egypt because the Suez Canal, because of the Israeli treaty, because they let us fly over their territory if we want to bomb somebody. It doesn't happen. And this has discredited the whole idea that the West has a stand on democracy and human rights. No one believes it. They thought maybe with Obama they would believe it. It's consistency in foreign policy probably doesn't exist, either in Europe or the United States, but this is one thing that is so chronic that no one believes it when they say this. What about the Muslim world? Because, of course, I basically lectured you on ideas embedded in Islam. It's wrong of the critics of Islam to say it's all Islam, and it's wrong for the defenders of Islam to say it has nothing to do with Islam. Of course it has something to do with Islam. It may be a distortion, but they're using texts. They're verbatim texts. They're not something they invent to justify this. For instance, there's a text, it's called the Pact of Omar. Omar ibn Khattab was one of the conquerors of Syria when the Arabs moved out of the Arabian Peninsula to conquer part of the Byzantine Empire and later part of the Persian Empire. And, you know, again, there were a lot of Christians, so what to do? They didn't want to destroy this. They knew what the cities, Damascus, glorious city, Alexandria, more than glorious city, even medieval Cairo, not as important as Alexandria, but something, right? Antioch. There was a certain amount of wealth, expertise, and plenty of infidels, plenty of Christians. So he wrote treaties, in some cases to avoid bloodshed. And let me say, for you who want to look at the history, there were not a few Christian groups that welcomed the Muslims because of these disputes over issues of Christian theology. The nature of Christ was a big one. And I'm not going to lecture. If someone wants to give a better lecture on this, it's very complicated, but they were very important at the time. In fact, they felt to be important. So for instance, the Coptic church in Egypt, they kind of folded over because they were having dispute over this issue of the nature of Christ with Rome, and they viewed the Muslims as just another group that believes in one God. That was it's not like they had a gigantic centuries of theology when the Muslims came. They said, God, Muhammad, that was pretty much it. So, okay, fine, come on in, you believe in one God, everything's fine. It turned out not to be like that, but the Pact of Omar set some restrictions on Christians. Some of them were quite onerous, quite difficult, and has been revived by these radical jihadists as if they had a basis in theology, in Islamic dogma. They don't. It's just a treaty. As a Muslim told me in Jerusalem, I brought up and said, what about this Pact of Omar? I said, the problem with their use of the Pact of Omar is they pretend it came from God. Pact of Omar was just a treaty, a 7th century treaty to boot. Why is it applicable today? Things have changed. And of course, the radical jihadists basically say nothing has changed. Muslims are unwilling, in my view, to recognize that the persecution of Christians is but a part, again, of this larger ideology that includes persecuting Muslims who don't agree with the jihadists. What evidence of it is? They say it outright. Bad Muslims can be declared heretics and killed. It's in their literature. It's not something I'm making up. Some of this dates from the 13th century, but it's alive today. As we know, governments, according to them, should be overthrown and their leaders killed if they don't carry out jihad. Is this put into practice, you may wonder? Just the other day, 300 Iraqis in Mosul were executed summarily and thrown into a mass grave. And there's been other incidents like that in Mosul. These are obviously Muslims. When I was in Erbil, I was interviewing some Christians, and one Christian actually got a sort of one of those Instagram things on your phone, however they work. And a friend of his, a Muslim friend of his, sent him a note saying, well, this is what happened to me. I tried to pretend that your furniture store belonged to me so that the Islamic State wouldn't seal it and make it property of the Islamic State. And to this message was attached a photo of him from the back, crisscrossed by whip marks, because he had refused, for as long as he could, to acknowledge that this was a Christian store. I got another one, a guy who was also beaten up, not killed, because he wrote something on Facebook against what was ever going on in Mosul. The Muslims are next. It happens, and it happens. And in Egypt, the Salafis in Egypt, who have been practicing sort of mob persecution of Christians during Mubarak's time and after, make it clear they hate the liberal Muslims, which exist in Egypt in not small numbers, as next in line. If you're a woman and you go down to central Cairo, you're going to have trouble not getting groped or certainly insulted. This is a big change for Egypt over the last 40 years. If you look at old Egyptian movies, anyone here been to Egypt? No. No one been to... Well, and you probably won't look at old Egyptian movies, but if you see these movies from the 50s in Alexandria, you'll see women playing beach ball in bikinis in Alexandria. If you go to Alexandria today to one of the beaches, the women, if they're in the water at all, are wearing niqab and hijab. Once, I didn't witness this, so this is an anecdote. Is it true or not? Don't know. Some friends in Alexandria said, you know, some Russian women were in Alexandria at one of the beach hotels and decided to go swimming. A mob of men got so large that the police had to be called in to look at these two women. Now, probably Russians here also taking care of their bank accounts, but you know, Russian women can be quite beautiful, but still 5,000 men on the Corniche of Alexandria. There's a famous old Egyptian beach west of Alexandria where there are little villas and stuff. It used to be called the Saint-Tropez of Egypt. And Egyptian women used to, you know, wear the bathing suits and then put a sarong or something and go shop for fruit. They can't do that anymore. And they had to put up screens on the beach so that men couldn't see them. Now, these are, frankly, the most minor issues, and including what regards Christians. But it's not, this strict ideology is also aimed at Muslims, not just Christians. And is it aimed at us here in Switzerland? Just as much as the ideology is aimed at other Muslims. Because listen, if you see a Christian getting beheaded and you're a Sunni, are you going to actually oppose the Islamic State in Raqqa? Are you going to get out of your store and say, you know, I don't have time to pray right now? You're not going to do that. It's not going to happen. You're going to be afraid. Because it's a little bit like when the communists killed the Tsar of Russia. It was a message to all Russians. We can do what we want. The deaths of Christians and the expulsion of Christians tells also Muslims, we can do what we want. You have to think twice, not just to stand up for Muslims, but to stand up against the other things that the Islamic State demands. I'm not optimistic. There are Muslim liberals, let me say, that, and some speak, but they have no political force. Their voices are not very loud. You don't see them on TV. I saw one today, a woman from Pakistan, of course she lives in Canada. She was speaking against this kind of thing I'm speaking of, the Salafis, the extreme version of Islam, and so on and so forth. But she lives in Canada. It's fine for her. And she's brave. She does speak out. You can get killed in Canada too. It's as hard as it seems to believe, but it can happen. And there are voices. In the 19th century, see if I can find them here, there were Islamic voices who spoke out against this strict reading of Islamic texts as a guide for Muslims in the 19th century. But it's difficult these days, more difficult even than it was for them. There's a man named, he's dead now, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. He's an Egyptian. He taught at Cairo University. He taught his students against the idea of relying on 13th century Islamic texts for guiding your activities today or your Islamic beliefs today. He was denounced by other professors at Cairo University who went to court to try and force the annulment of his marriage to his Muslim wife because Muslim women cannot marry heretics. At that time, the terror group Jamaat Islamiyah, also an extreme conservative group, put out that he should be killed. And you think, oh, this would never happen in Cairo, but remember that Naguib Mahfouz, the famous Nobel Prize-winning author, was once stabbed in the streets. He survived, but stabbed in the streets of Cairo one day because he wrote a book that kind of referred to Muhammad and Islam, and it was declared. It was kind of early Rushdie kind of thing. Anyway, he went into exile to the Netherlands, and that's where he died. Another one, Ahmed Subhi Mansour. I don't know him, and I'm sorry I didn't. He was working at a professor at Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is the leading Islamic university in probably the entire Middle East. He also said that it was declared, he proposed in a public statement that violent teachings should be expunged from Islam. People shouldn't preach these things. He was declared by Azhar an enemy of Islam, and the government, this is where I get in the idea that the government protects minorities and all this stuff. He was in prison for 2 months, and in 2002 fled to the United States. He continues to write. You can find him on Google. If you want anyone's interested in him, I'll give it to you. And in 2011, he protested online, but he's in the United States. The killing of Christian demonstrators is a famous incident that happened in October 2011 when Christians were protesting on the banks of the Nile, and the army shot down 25, or ran over and shot down 25. He protested that and suggested that mosques or churches should be built freely in Egypt, and that it should be against the law to preach violence in mosques. But he's not in Egypt anymore. It's not easy to be a dissident in any of these countries. And today in Egypt, all sorts of people are being thrown in jail. Part of the influence, again, is Saudi Arabia. They have used their money to spread this ideology, Wahhabism. I can't go into the many countries, including Bosnia, where mosques are built and the preachers are from Saudi Arabia. It's a very retrograde form of Islam, in my view. I'm not Muslim. I get this idea that it's retrograde from other Muslims, but again, the kind of Muslims maybe I hang around with will not be Wahhabis. You might ask, why should a Muslim care? In fact, I mean, these are Christians. Let the West take care of them. They're sort of Christian. And I want to close by noting, of course, that I'm mystified by the fact that Muslim leaders themselves, especially religious leaders, because no Muslim politician has the credibility to speak out on these issues. They're all in it for money, and they're repressive, and that they don't see that the persecution of Christians is but the first step toward other kind of persecutions if these people gain power, or, as they do in parts of Iraq and Syria, exercise power. And of course, I was reminded by the situation in Europe in the 30s, in Germany in the 30s. And you probably are all aware of this poem written by a Lutheran pastor in the 30s. His name was Martin, excuse me if I pronounce it wrong, Niemöller. And it's well known. In fact, in my country, it's become a cliche. No one pays attention to this poem, but it's well known. And I don't know here whether this has any, in Europe, this is the kind of thing that's ever brought up again. He wrote, of course, and the order he gave was that first the Nazis went after the communists. He was talking about the Nazis. Then they went after the trade unionists. Then disabled people. Then Jews. And he said, of course, no one said anything about this. And he concludes the poem and by this very famous line, "Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." This is certainly ignored in the Middle East by the Muslims, by their leadership. In some ways, it's ignored by the West. I mean, what's in it for the West, in fact? If you view the persecution of Christians as part of a larger ideology, you also view it as something that gave rise to Paris and Brussels. It's not like that Europeans, or Americans for that matter, San Bernardino, are immune from the ideology. Again, I don't want to excuse Western foreign policy, but these are attacks on civilians. And in the West, they're supposed to not kill civilians. They do. And there's no reason to excuse Muslims from killing civilians. It's not the issue that they're Christians. They are civilians. They're men, women, and children. And these are war crimes. And no one yet, which is curious to me, has suggested, because some of the commanders, you can find the names of commanders online. They're not secret, in fact, that these people should be prosecuted in international court at some point. Al-Baghdadi himself. I mean, I'm going off now on tangents. You remember during the Kosovo War, the United States compelled somehow the European Criminal Court to charge Milosevic with war crimes in Bosnia. Well, that hasn't happened with the Islamic. I don't know why. I can't answer this. To conclude, do I think this long laundry list of things that I've laid out are going to happen? I'm not optimistic that the Iraqis will get refugee status. Maybe they'll trickle out over time, but it's been 2 years. Certainly Syria the war's in its 5th year. The Lebanese civil war lasted 15 years. Imagine what Syria will look like if it goes on for another 10 years. Egypt, the Copts' number are big enough to survive, and they have a certain amount of influence, but they have influence with the dictator. This is a problem for minorities. They gravitate to power. Palestine, the Palestinians tell me, yeah, okay, everyone tells us to stay, we're leaving, and so Israel and Palestine will be museums of a dead Christianity. The pilgrims will go to the church, they'll go to this place where the Sermon on the Mount took place, they'll go to the Church of the Nativity, they'll go to the Holy Sepulchre, but they won't find Palestinians worshiping there. That's what they say. I'm pessimistic. It's been the situation of Christians, the dire circumstance has accelerated. It will not be turned back. So many things, as I sort of laid out, are needed. That dignified Christian life is pretty much dead in the Middle East. There was a time when Christians had influence. Now they're just observers at their own demise. Thank you. Sorry for the bad news. Thank you very much.